But first, for years, people have called into question the role social media outlets played in framing the narrative, in particular being the arbiters of what is and isn't so-called fake news. And for years, these same people have been hounded down as conspiracy theorists. Well, today, a lot of people have owed an apology, with Meta CEO, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg openly admitting and regretting that Facebook and Instagram censored COVID posts and election content under pressure from senior figures in the Biden-Harris White House. Now, this is a huge admission and one that will have huge implications for the upcoming election and more. Joining me to discuss this, foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, I think we all saw it firsthand in The Voice, Greg. I mean, things that I said about the actual length, the true length of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, they were taken down from Facebook. We had to use lawyers to argue our case and then get them put back up. We can see how more and more Facebook, frames the narrative, particularly in politics. So I'm not surprised by this, but I'm very disheartened to hear that it's been done so openly.
Well, you're right, Peter. I mean, this is quite shocking. You're right. It happened a lot in The Voice. Our friends at the IPA weren't allowed to promote videos that they made, which were not remotely hate speech or anything like that. They just had a different view of The Voice from the received wisdom, the approved religion of our day. And this was enforced, even though it turned out 60% of Australians voted no. I think the Hunter Biden laptop thing is the most disgraceful of all, because probably Biden wouldn't have won that election if that story had been properly ventilated. It showed that Hunter Biden was guilty of all kinds of criminality, and it had a lot of very weirdly incriminating and suggestive material about the involvement of his dad, Joe Biden, who's been president for the last 4 years, in Hunter Biden's business activities. There was no smoking gun that Joe Biden had accepted bribes, but there was really smelly stuff, much more smelly than anything produced about Donald Trump. And the social media companies refused to allow the story to be ventilated on their platforms. This was gross political censorship. So you've got two problems with social media. You've got to civilise it. It's got to get rid of, calls for people to be murdered and, doxing, publishing people's private addresses and so forth. It can't do that, apparently. But what it can do is censor normal political debate.
Is it going to change things, do you think, for the Republicans now that this information's been out there and publicly admitted by Zuckerberg?
To be honest, Peter, I don't think it will. I think this campaign is running very badly for Trump at the moment. Now, it might turn around. Harris is a very weak candidate in essence, but the majority of the American media wants Harris to win. And therefore, I don't think we're going to see things suppressed in the way they were with the Hunter Biden laptop. But it's just not going to make an issue of any of this. I watched the Democratic convention. CNN has a big thing about its fact checkers. Well, all the way through the Democratic convention, they were saying Trump wants to have a national ban on abortion and he wants to prevent IVF from being used. These things are both completely untrue. There's not a Republican in the US who wants to limit IVF, and Trump has said he wants abortion to be handled by the states and not. And Vance says if Congress ever passed a ban, Trump would veto it. But the fact checkers for CNN didn't mention either of those matters. So the pro-Harris media has just decided that there are no bad stories about Harris and no good stories for Trump. So even though I think this is a shocking development with social media, I think in a sense Americans already know it in a way, and the people who would be influenced by it have already sort of factored it in. Now, Trump's not behind by much, but he's behind by enough to lose the election right now.
Let's go to your discussion with John Howard, where you were talking about the visas being doled out to people from Gaza. I think it was really significant that you spoke to Howard and he weighed in on it. One thing he noted is he can't believe Labor hasn't cleaned up the comments from Mike Burgess. Now, I think they haven't cleaned them up, because what Burgess was doing was he wasn't freelancing. You've got to conclude, if 2 and a bit weeks on, they haven't been contested. His points about, you can be a sympathiser of Hamas and that won't disqualify you from getting a visa. It must be government policy for them to stand like they have.
Well, that's a fair inference, Peter. I was very grateful to Mr. Howard for agreeing to talk to me, and I thought his intervention was enormously important. He is the elder statesman of our nation. With Bob Hawke, he's one of the two great post-Menzies Prime Minister Australia has ever had. And he is shocked that anyone could suggest you can have rhetorical sympathy for Hamas and still come into Australia. One reason I don't think it's just Burgess simply stating government policy is this. There are, as you know, Peter, there are two levels to granting someone a visa. There's first the security question. Will this person possibly become a terrorist or provide material support to terrorists? And that's what ASIO mainly decides on. Then there is the second question. Does this person pass the character test? So loads and loads of people are denied visas to Australia. There'd be thousands of cases we'd never hear of because of the character test without concluding that they are a positive security threat. Yet when Peter Dutton asked Anthony Albanese in the Parliament, would support for Hamas disqualify you on the character test, Albanese just confused everything by saying, well, ASIO is involved in all these clearances. Now, that's not even true on its face, but also it doesn't answer the question of what the government would decide on a character test. I think Burgess did misspeak, and I think he meant to make something like the distinction that I just made there. But it's an unbelievable bugger's muddle from the government, and the government hasn't given us any. So it won't defend Burgess's comments, it won't repudiate them, and it won't explain them. So if this is government policy, it should explain that. And Howard was absolutely right to say this is a muddle which is damaging the nation. The fact that the Albanese government is so cowardly in running away from this issue and won't explain. Richard Marles, disgraceful last weekend. He just wouldn't answer a straight question about visas. And the government thinks this is a correct way to treat the Australian people, as if we're impertinent because we ask about it. It's wrong for us just to ask about it.
I've got to say, though, do they think Australians live in a bubble? Do they think that Australians are not watching what's playing out? A case in Germany on the weekend, 3 dead, a number of others, stabbed in street festivals, I think it was. A lot of anger there over the connections of the individual, his background, Islamic State now claiming responsibility. We've seen a synagogue burnt down in France, elsewhere. This is a tinderbox in Europe, and people are concerned that their governments are not putting national security front and centre, and that this has got out of control, that they no longer can control these waves of illegal migration and the risks it's having to the cohesion inside countries. Australians are looking at that and saying, for God's sake, do not bring this here. And yet the government's giving them no confidence they've got this under control.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Peter. So Islamist terrorism never went away. Let me say, the vast majority of Muslims who've ever come to Australia are perfectly law-abiding people and so on. However, if you take a lot of people from a radicalised population, such as, the population in Gaza, not with, and that's not to diminish the tragedy that civilians in Gaza are experiencing right now. But if you take a lot of people from a radicalised population, of course, any one of them is very unlikely to be a terrorist or a security threat, but a significant minority will give you some trouble down the track. That's just absolutely predictable. Now, Hamas, we know, its whole raison d'etre, everything about it, is anti-Semitic hatred and anti-Western hatred. So why? It's just sort of, can you believe, Peter, we're having this discussion that an Australian government would say
Greg,
that rhetorical support for Hamas is okay? It's just, I have to pinch myself. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen in a long life in journalism.